Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Chanoff, the Director of Office Performing Arts and Film and the co-producer of Bangsokol. We are thrilled and delighted that you're joining us today for this panel, which is entitled Cambodia, From Cambodia to the World, Creative Collaboration Among Unlikely Partners. The event is part of the Arts and Healing Bangsokol Virtual Festival, which is co-presented between Cambodian Living Arts and Arts Emerson, and made possible thanks to the support of the Ministry of Culture of Taiwan and the collaboration of 50 other partners and artists from 7 countries. Today's event is contributing to HowlRound Theatre Commons, a free and open platform for theater makers worldwide. It'll be focused on the commissioning process of Bangsokol, a Requiem for Cambodia. The office got involved in Bangsokol as producers early on, and our mission was really to bring this profound and compelling work to the world, because the beauty of it is it so specifically speaks to a Cambodian experience that resonates globally and with all of humanity, and so important, especially now when there are genocides that have happened before and after, and it's a story that must be told so that hopefully humanity learns from it and we don't keep repeating this horrific event. To make anything happen in theater, it takes a whole ecosystem. It takes the brilliant artists who conjure up the work, but it also takes the collaboration of the people who are going to produce it and present it. And the presenters are people who've commissioned it and brought money to it and brought audiences to it and brought their institutions to it. In this case, it was commissioners from across the world, led by Joe Malillo, who is at BAM, and Stephen Armstrong, who is at the Melbourne Festival, and also David Dower from Arts Emerson. And they really were key in making this happen. Joe Malillo decided that this was a piece that needed to speak to the world. And he, as a leader in the field, really gathered the troops from across the world to have everybody come together and make this piece be possible. So today we're going to hear from all of the presenters, from the commissioners who were key players in making this happen. And to guide us through this panel is a woman who is a total force in our international ecology of arts and presenting. She's the executive director of the Hong Kong Festival, but she's also an extraordinary advocate for art, and she's an author, and she is an important campaigner for women's causes. And she is someone who has been instrumental in bringing art from all over the world and creating a platform where artists can be heard. So we are so honored to have with us to guide us through Tisa Ho. Before we move to the panel, we have a video from Stephen Armstrong, who's the creative director of the Arts Center of Melbourne, who unfortunately couldn't join the discussion today, but was so important to the process. He came early on to our first workshop in Cambodia and thought so deeply about the progress, the creative process, and who could be involved and should be involved in making this project, and really the creation of this project. So Stephen has some words for us, and here they are.
I'm Stephen Armstrong, and I'm Creative Director for the Asia Topa program at Arts Centre Melbourne. And it was my pleasure to collaborate with Plu and Prim and Rachel Chernoff to help bring the premiere of Bangsokol to the stage in Melbourne in October 2017. I'm really sorry I can't be with you. I've been called up to do what's called jury duty here, keeping our democracy alive in Melbourne. I know where I would rather be, but please accept my apologies. Melbourne is home to the largest Cambodian community in Australia. Most of the Cambodian community here arrived as refugees in the 1970s and 80s. So on average, they were in their 20s. By the time we presented Bangsokol, most would have been parents and grandparents of second generation Cambodian Australians, many of whom, as I understand it, did not know their family stories. The truth is that while we've all grown up together in multicultural Australia, Khmer culture, along with many Southeast Asian cultures, is really not very often seen on our main stages, something that I work very hard to counter. So when I met Plu and Prim, and I think it was in Tokyo, and I heard about the work of Cambodian living arts, before I knew it, I'd changed my flights and I was heading to Phnom Penh. I doubt that I'm the first person this has happened to. And as luck would have it, CAL was hosting a symposium on art in a post-trauma society. And when I think about that subject from an Australian standpoint, there is nothing post about the living trauma of Australia's First Nations people and the generational inheritance of so many migrants living in Australia. So the subject is a really important one, and especially through the lens of the Cambodian experience. The visit had quite an impact on me, not just visiting the sites of the Khmer Rouge atrocities, but also enjoying the vitality of Khmer culture today and the extraordinary vitality and virtuosity and imagination of contemporary and traditional performances that I saw both in Phnom Penh and Siem Reap. One of the things that really struck me was spending time at Baipana and exploring the documentary archives with Riti Pan. After viewing his film, The Missing Picture, in that context, that was a very powerful experience. The impossible beauty of Riti's work filled me with a kind of need to be part of this project, to bring the Australian community through his art of survival and resistance together. The promise of nurturing a future through the imagination. And even more so, I can't think of a more significant thing to commit oneself to now in this very fragile century. And the more I learned about Riti's concept for Bangsokol and Him Sophie's amazing music, I literally began to imagine it on the stage of Art Centre Melbourne. And by now, of course, I was completely in the thrall of Plu and Rachel. I knew there was no getting out of it. We were in this together. I also began to think about how singular and authentic moments in art demand really new vocabularies. We build on the forms of traditional and innovation simultaneously to try and give voice to the present, even when that's tethered to the past. Bangsokol was not only an eye-watering poetic song cycle and film, it was the dynamics of performance by Him Savi and Bell and Sam Ah, and the traditional and Western instrumentalists and the extraordinary chorus from Taiwan. There was a narrative being created through the placement and movement of live bodies on stage, which needed to acknowledge the immediacy of Him's score and the enormity of Riti's images and the emotions that both held. But what worried me was how the spirits of the murdered were going to be freed if their families and relatives now living in Melbourne weren't integral to this event. In the conversations that we'd had together, I was really aware that bringing the Melbourne Festival into this partnership as a major presenter, which we definitely needed to do, and bless them, both to secure the financial resources, but also to give it the artistic status that it needed as a major international work. That this also risked the performance being thought of as an exclusive or elite event, especially as we were presenting it in Melbourne Arts Centre's very beautiful, but also quite prestigious concert hall. And it wasn't just possible, it was actually probable that most members of the local Cambodian community had never been to Arts Centre Melbourne. It made us ask ourselves, why should this community trust us with their story? Why should they pay money to come to Arts Centre Melbourne to experience their own culture? These were important questions, and the solutions needed to be found, we felt, in the art itself, in how the work was actually finally conceived for the stage. The work needed to insist its own authority, And certainly we couldn't think about marketing the work as a separate activity. We needed to build community connection into the actual producing and connect the imagination of the creators with the imaginations of the audience as a fundamental act. We needed to think of Bangsokol not as a film and song cycle, but as a requiem, a staged ritual and an event where things are literally enacted as well as felt. And we needed a stage director to serve Ritti and him's vision while bringing all of these elements together. I proposed Australian choreographer and theatre artist Gideon Abazanik. Gideon has been specialising for many years in creating events which dissolve the distance between the stage and the auditorium. Gideon's work also has always showed the great strength of choreographic sensibility in shaping physical and emotional experience through the push and pull of music and imagery in real time, and how to create an alternative experience of time through ritual and gesture. Our hopes for Bangsokol were nothing short of connecting the living with the spirits of the forgotten, to create a space for the past and the present to occur simultaneously, and in doing so to free the future. So while Ritti and Gideon resolved how this was going to be presented through the beautiful River of Life created on stage and the extraordinary moments with the young people, back at home, I was working with a woman named Cedar Douglas and her colleague Sambath Kim for quite a few months to socialise the project. And we did this primarily through Khmer radio and through Melbourne's Buddhist temples. We produced information in Khmer, we organised transport at the right hour. Many of our local community could not afford to take time off work, which meant travelling at dinner time, which meant making sure that we had buses that could accommodate their families and provide meals on those buses, appropriate food. It was really important to us that when they returned for the opening night performance, they were returning. They were comfortable with the protocols and relaxed about bringing their kids and their food into the building. We made hard copy tickets available to avoid the problem of credit cards. We'd been advised that credit is not popular among the Cambodian community. And we also obviously invited the monks in to ritually cleanse the space. Understanding the potential distress of this work and the fact that many families had not seen Khmer culture performed on a general public stage or seen any imagery from the genocide represented through artworks, we screened the missing picture and we hosted a large community event with some of the original artists from Phnom Penh in the weeks before the premiere. This also gave us the opportunity to introduce the artists to Melbourne's media so they could understand their responsibility in reporting the event. We were overjoyed when more than 500 community members volunteered to be part of the performance, which enjoyed a fantastic and highly emotional and an unforgettable response from full houses. The concert hall at Arts Centre Melbourne seats close to 3,000 people, so these were really big gigs. Bangsokol offered a really exquisite demonstration that despite the horrors of the recent past, Khmer art and culture has an enduring role in our common story, and that it is creativity which vouchsafes our collective future. Thank you for listening. I hope this perspective was interesting. I would so much rather be in a conversation than presenting like this. I remain very proud of Bangsokol. I adore the people that we worked with on this and the creative daring and finesse of the team, the performers, the creators, and my colleague producers. Some projects need the whole world to wrap their arms around them, and these are the projects which in turn give life back to us all. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Jean-Baptiste and the CAL team, and everyone, take care. Bye.
We're so honored to welcome Tisa Ho.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. I feel like Johnny Come Lately or you know, Johnny Come Lately, whatever. in this process, not having been a part of it from the beginning, but enormously privileged to have been allowed a little role in this discussion. I think commissioning empowers us all. Those of us who make art, those of us who present performances, with co-commissioning, with working together, we have more resources. We gather the abilities and the capacities of more than one, and coming together is really very often what the arts are about. So therefore, co-commissioning makes a lot of sense. Not It's not always easy, and as anybody who works in partnership understands, there are fantastic partners and sometimes wonderful work result, as in this case, and partners go on to become friends, which is even better. And I sense that this is the case here. And of the people who I will have the honor and the privilege of having a conversation with, are three who are really critical to this process. So I would like to bring them on perhaps one by one, starting with the man with whom this whole thing started, and is of course an absolute force in the Cambodian living arts today, right? And we know him from what has been happening in this festival already. So um, my I would like to address the first question to Fren, and then to introduce Joe and to introduce Johnny, who will join us with other questions from them, so that we can have this conversation flowing. Um, if I can ask Fren and go back to actually prehistory, before this project, before um, um, the project began, even to a couple of years when he was working, when he brought a whole group of Cambodian artists to New York. I think it was 2013. How did that happen, and did that sow seeds for this enormously important collaboration, Glenn?
When Cambodian Living Arts in 2013 organized and produced this huge, humongous festival called the Season of Cambodia in New York in 2013, when we brought about 125 Cambodian artists to New York with 34 venues in the whole New York City during 1 month. The process of pulling that amazing festival began also by connecting with many people around the world, but especially in New York. We The way we were able to connect with presenters in New York was to invite them to Cambodia. And it was the beginning of a process where, at that time, we've pulled out a really small funding, a seed funding from the Asia Cultural Council to sponsor a trip for 5 presenters from New York to come to Cambodia. In that trip, there was someone from the Asia Society, someone from a dance festival. Now I had a blank, but also at that time the executive producer of the Brooklyn Academy of Music, Joe, who's in this panel, and it was also my first somehow professional engagement on hosting also major presenter from New York to Cambodia, and we weren't sure how these international venue would look to our work in the country. So it was a 1 week touring on several places in Phnom Penh, in Battambang. We didn't have like the infrastructure of having a ready theater and proscenium stage to present the work. And so most of the work have been seen kind of on more like rehearsal or even in those schools where things were happening. And it's from that I think my relationship with Joe Malillo started when, in his rigid status of the executive producer of BAM, I wasn't sure how I can even get him involved and interested to us, because at that time, like I understood that he was a big name of the presenting world around the world. So I was quite impressed by him. And it's how it
Yeah.
began, because I always remember that time when he saw the work and the dress rehearsal of the Royal Ballet of Cambodia in the setup of the school. At the end of the conversation later on, at the end of the presentation later on, I think just after lunch, he took me aside and he said, Plun, I really now understand the work that you are doing here in Cambodia. And I will, the Brooklyn Academy of Music will present the Royal Ballet of Cambodia. If I remember,
Wow.
I repeat that conversation. And
Wow.
it started to begin the relationship between, I think, people to people that had built the institutional partnership. And then leading to that, when we had the Bangsokol commissioning, I reach out to him and say, you know, we have this production, would you be interested? And it began that way, in fact.
That's such a good narrative. And this is obviously the moment to bring in Joe Malillo, who knows the world, and you can't mention New York, you know, without mentioning Joe. He is one of the most preeminent producers. He's led the Brooklyn Academy of Music from strength to strength. He is that odd. Well, nowadays it seems odd, but actually it applies. This comment applies to all of our speakers in this panel. Deeply rooted in his own nation, and yet a complete internationalist. I mean, Joe has been honored by the governments of France, of Britain, of Sweden, of I can't remember. The list of honors goes on. No, he's a cultural diplomat as well as a producer. So, Joe, you know, we can take about 2 hours just going through this, but I would like to focus now to on your response. Was that your first visit to Cambodia? And how did you respond to the invitation?
The answer to the question, first of all, practically, yes. That was my virginal inaugural visit to Cambodia. And it is interesting to note that a colleague of mine who's no longer with us, Sam Miller, would go to Cambodia with some consistency. And I had conversations with him, but the kind of curatorial work and what he was interested in didn't conform to what I think BAM, Brooklyn Academy of Music, I'll use BAM, the acronym, the service that the institution can provide. So that's why I want to connect the dots between Fluin and my conversation, which simply for the season of Cambodia that he wanted to position in New York City. The service that my institution could provide, his objective was by putting the work of the largest scale on the Opera House stage of BAM. It was disarming to be able to see these very beautiful young women, some are more mature than young, actually being sewn into their costumes in order to do this exquisite work that I had never seen before. And I was certain that no one in New York City during the season of Cambodia would have seen it themselves. And so that there was like an amazing discovery, a very extreme traditional form, with the background being artisanally, sensitively being reconstructed. And I want to make sure that I say the framing correctly, that in my time with Mr. Prim, I understand his vision and strategy for Cambodia culture, for the Cambodia society, that how to enable this post-traumatic society, how to revitalize it through art and culture. And the phenomena was that this was one of the great artistic accomplishments of the culture of Cambodia. And I know that I could make it possible to bring that to New York City, which gave it a context of, this is one of the great cultures of the world. And this is, it's now reconstructing its art and cultural life.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very thorough insight. We see this now coming from both sides, from the Cambodian perspective of reaching out to New York, and from you, Joe, of seeing this, discovering, as you say, this amazing culture, this exquisiteness, and what it has to offer, not only New York, but possibly the world, you know. But I'm sensing, although the both of you are very modest about this, I'm sensing there was a real personal connection as well. And forgive me if this is pushing into a non-professional realm, but a lot of what we do in commissioning actually is based on relationships. We're putting our institutions, you know, to some degree at risk. We're putting our resources out there. We're getting artists to do stuff that maybe they hadn't even thought about before. So there's a lot at stake here, and the trust and the linking between people, I think, on the basis of which great collaborations can happen, cannot be underestimated. So I'd like both of you to speak a little bit about this as well. There's a higher priority, which is revival and Cambodia and heritage and the arts, and an international audience. But beneath that, there is a very personal dynamic that I'm sensing, and I'd love you to speak about.
Oh, well, I'm going to be emphatic in telling you that at the foundation of this professional adventure that I had was a friendship with Fluin that I respect him immensely. My life, my major career was to service the BAM and the New York City. Fluin was servicing a country with his vision. And I have rarely encountered an individual who wanted to tackle an artistic and cultural strategy for their country. So, you know, I spent a lot of quality time with this man and understood what direction he was going and how I could help him. And one of the things that I could help him to do was to remain objective about his thinking, about how he wanted to produce Bangsokol. That was the end game of like, oh, you're going to get the best of my objective thinking about what you're telling me. I'm not going to allow the friendship to mess up. I want you to have my best thinking on the subject of how to get from A to B to C and to an opening night within a global context.
I can totally see that happening on an administrative and management and resource allocation and contractual dimension, all of the nuts and bolts that make this work. But at the bottom of this, and this is the third layer, right? There's this enormous agenda that you both have in your respective organizations, in your country, in one case. There is the wonderfully deep and respectful friendship and then there's the nuts and bolts. But in there's another layer, which is the artistic work. So I want to ask Prem, where were the where what parts of it were you driving? What parts of it did the co-commissioners come in with? Either in New York and Melbourne for that matter. How does the selection of all the partner artists work? And at what point in the creative process did the co-commissioners, have input, have brought their weight to bear on the process and the outcomes?
Thank you, Tisa, and thank you, Joe. I guess also one thing I'd like just to add on to kind of completing Joe's beautifully shared friendship is also Joe had been such a great mentor. Also, I think in the world that we're working in the performing arts or in arts and culture, in fact, being mentor by some of the most senior professionals in the industry is really helping us in terms of guiding our decision because this world is so big and it could be frightening. But in fact, I've received so much. It's not just the friendship, but the mentorship that Joe had provided throughout all the different process of work that we had. So I just want to mention this. For Tisa, like I run Cambodian Living Art is a grassroots. It used to be a really small grassroots organization, finding masters in countryside and then setting up classes in those countryside with few staff and really like in the supporting masters and the transmission of these oral tradition of Cambodia. We grew up out of that on our first decade. And when I came as the executive director of Cambodian Living Arts, I was enormously taken by that vision of the country. And I think what Joe's mentioning is myself being Cambodian. I was born in Cambodia, but fortunately, I escaped the genocide, grew up in Canada, was educated, and it came back 21 years ago. My sense of reconnecting with my culture was so strong, and that can lead Cambodian Living Arts. And I think connecting to what Joe says is the organization really have a bold vision of helping to support the sector and the country as a whole. From that, my work is just to carry the legacy of the transmission that had happened with the masters and the students, but also to share it to the world. But I wasn't a producer or executive producer, neither even those terms that I've learned throughout like commissioning and all of that learned throughout working in the field. But I had that passion, and from that passion, I started just to meet people. And I guess, maybe lucky in this world is that I've met really interesting, influential, and meaningful people through the work that we have done, through fundraising activity, through meeting with people. And so from that, why I'm setting the context is because, as you said, Tisa, you point out, it's by building those relationships that we then find the directions to push important projects like the Season of Cambodia or Bangsokol, because there's no way we could pull it out on ourselves, because we would not have the funding, we would have the presenter, and neither also the artistic collaboration that is needed. From the beginning, Bangsokol started with a beautiful, meaningful project. It is totally mission driven. It's not about like the work of one artist that wants to be stages, but it's about the mission of why we are producing this work. So Dr. Him Sopi, the composer, composed this requiem with a sense of his own story, of what he endured during the genocide. And when I heard the first bits of the first 6 or 7 minutes of the music, I'm not a music specialist, but I was taken by the music. I had goosebumps on just like listening to it. But I didn't know how that would perceive, and I thought like maybe if we were to look at only a music concert, it will not tell the whole story. So I didn't know much Ritipan, in fact, at that time, the Cambodian filmmaker, but I've seen his work. So I introduced him to the music of Him Supi, and I started to create that artistic collaboration together. And both of them didn't know each other well and never worked together, but were inspired again by the idea and the mission of the work artistically. And they came together.
Yeah,
and so,
that it's again about bringing people together,
Yeah.
and I think since you talk about music, it's a perfect cue to bring in the other panelist who's been waiting in the waiting room. I'm sorry to keep you so long, Johnny, but these conversations
No
are
problem.
fascinating. It was hard to break into this. I wanted to bring you in right now for two reasons. One is because Flem mentioned music, and you are the specialist in this. I mean, Johnny's involvement in music is deep and wide, particularly in choral music, and his organization has something like so different from the Cambodian arts one, has something like 40 different organizations within this umbrella, right? And he's active in the choral work throughout Asia and indeed the world. So another person who is deeply rooted in his community and yet entirely globally facing. So what was your impression of this process, and also working, and this is where the co-commissioning, collaborating dynamics come in again, working with an organization that is structurally so different from your own?
We first heard of this project, Bangsokol, was in, I think, 2016. And, at that time, to be honest, we knew very little about Cambodia. It's a name of a country. We've never been visited there before, but we saw this project, and this project is so interesting to us because it's draw the inspiration from the Cambodian history and the traditional music, and it requires Cambodian traditional instruments and Western orchestra and choir, and also film and theater, everything. And as Tisa mentioned before, my organization, Taipei Philharmonic, is an organization that has 10 choirs, 3 orchestras, musical theater, and opera. So this is a perfect project for us to, to try to get involved and to get to know a different culture. And the process, I have to say it's difficult for us first because first of all, the choir, the singing in such difficult language. It's not Cambodian. It's actually an ancient Buddhism sutra, the Pali. We couldn't understand anything of that. Fortunately, we found a monk who's from Sri Lanka and he happened to be in Taiwan studying at that time. So through this kind of collaboration and work, we learned more about this piece. And we did our first workshop in Taiwan, which is, I think, the first time everything put together. And at that time, that was the first time we saw Ritipan's film. And it was that moment we realized that every work that we've done was worth it because it was so moving. All our players and singers were crying after our first dress rehearsal because through the music, we know that it is powerful, but with the film together, everything combined together, we know that we are making a history, and we are very, very happy and honored to be a part of this. And then after that, we started to, perform in different places, and we did some, changes through time, but all in all, this experience for us, for our singers and players, it was an unforgettable experience.
But how did the first connection happen, Johnny, between you and Ren? This was an invitation? So we know that in 2013 there was an invitation to a group of presenters. You were not party to that.
No, not
at the time, yeah. And I know, and we know from this conversation that Flem reached out to Sophie, to the filmmakers, to various people to put the creative team together, as it were, aided and abetted and guided and mentored by the redoubtable Joe Malillo. And so your connection, I think people interested in how these collaborations happen might be curious to know, and as I am, of how that contact, how that was done. Well, either of you could answer that.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Johnny,
Johnny?
and I can complete.
Okay. We actually first heard of this project from the Ministry of Culture of Taiwan, because they got this information from Plum that they have this project. So, and they were looking for an institute that can manage all these different things, because at that time, I believe Plum was already have this piece almost finished and looking for a place to do a workshop, to do a test run, to do the final adjustment. And that's where, when we heard from our Ministry of Culture that there was this project, and my colleague Esther, she actually met Plum the year before in, I believe it's in Melbourne Festival. So when I mentioned this to our colleagues, Esther told me that, oh, she met Plum before, and he has some, he heard of this project too. So that's when we started to look into this project. And in December 2016, I was invited to watch the rehearsal, or at that time, it was Gideon working with the dancers and trying to put together this theatrical piece. And that was my first time visiting Cambodia. And that was my first time actually looking at the score and the piece. So then we decided that this is a project that we can do, and this is the project that we must do.
Okay, so what I'm getting is that, again, that human dimension, that dimension of somebody that, as Joe had defined, so there's a passion, there's a real mission, there's an alignment of missions of the parties, and then on top of that or below that or supporting that, wherever that fits, a real personal connection and mutual respect and admiration. I think that those are the most wonderful and precious ingredients to come together to make a project like this succeed. And congratulations to all of you on this phenomenal success, on this phenomenal work that's been created. Now, one of the things about these sessions is that there's a limit on time. And so I think we have, moments for last words on this panel before we probably need to be keep quiet and be shunted back into some sort of waiting room. So, Joe, did you want to say something?
Yes, I wanted to compliment your artistic statement and observation, because the response to the project was purely authentic by all parties. And when you encounter authenticity, and which is based on humanity, it's a very disarming truth. And there's a certain intrinsic beauty in this path. And that has been the success of Bangsokol. And everyone was doing their best work. And the credit to Rachel Chanoff, who was the earth mother of driving the project to its multiple opening nights. Again, thoughtful, insightful decision-making, sensitive to the artists, sensitive to the presenters, and coming to a path to get to the opening night. My final words, Tisa.
Thank you, Joe. Johnny, before we go back to Flem.
This project is really brought a lot of impact to I should say, our singers, our players, and also those audience who were in the workshop presentation, because it's been 3 years now, but there are still people asking, when are you going to bring that complete work back to Taiwan? Because there were a lot of audience, a lot of presenters in that audience for that workshop presentation. And for this kind of work, it's not just an artwork, it's the meaning behind it, the humanity, which is the united language for the whole world. And this is the thing that people will pay attention to and should pay attention to. So hopefully we can bring this piece to many more places in the future.
Thank you, Johnny. And Clem, the last word to you before we hand this back to Earth Mother.
Just to wrap up the session and also kind of connecting is one part that people might have asked is like, how do they fund it or how do they make it happen? But in fact, we've never had like, it's not like we've received like the funding and we knew how to spend it and to make the process happening. In fact, it's through each of the processes. It's a mixture of, because it's so much mission driven, it's a mixture of partnership and of course some funding, but it really began by the partnership. The partnership with the Taipei Philharmonic Orchestra was because we didn't have a choir, and I was looking for a choir within the region. I wanted a choir that is Asian, that can be sensitive to the language itself, even though we are talking about a language that has disappeared. And I wanted to bring Asian together. So we've connected with the Taipei Philharmonic in this way. We also work with them because we didn't have a proscenium stage in Phnom Penh. So to workshop it, we needed a space. So they contributed, those space and that expertise to us. So it was really building the partnership that led us to ways of funding. And I think in this time of the world and where we are, it's impossible to have like $1 million funding to make something. You have to believe in how artistically and mission driven your project is, and then connect with people that can come and support the work that you're trying to pull out. And it's the way then from as I think Joe said, like from finding the right producer like Rachel Shanoff and her production office to believe in this project and not charging us at the beginning a big fee, but believing that she will accompany the process. So then, she gets a way to get involved. And so through every step of this process, money was not like what had driven us. It was the mission, the creative process, the partnership, the friendship that had led us for making and presenting then this Cambodia product to the world stage of the Melbourne Arts Centre Melbourne and the Melbourne International Festival, and then to Brooklyn Academy of Music, to the Arts Emerson in Boston, and then to Philharmonie of Paris, and then back to Cambodia. So this has been really beautiful, and I hope that we will be, as Johnny said, like continuing to tour this world, and especially in this time of the pandemic, why arts matter, and through difficult time, how do we become resilient and strong and continue what we're doing?
Thank you so much. Thank you all for all of the wisdom and I have so many keywords buzzing now to take away from this, and I hope that other people watching will have this as well. For me, there were two important takeaways, including one, don't be afraid of big ideas without the resources. And two, you don't need to have the complete work to show people. So find a school hall, it's a showcase, it's what you're thinking about. I think from Joe came that word authenticity, from Clem vision, and from Johnny, the partnership. So thank you for the privilege of having this conversation with you. And I think my job now is to hand this back to the redoubtable Rachel, Earth Mother of this project, to wind up.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank such a brilliant panel of creators and Tisa for guiding us through and for being a force in our world. And I just want to also say that in things like this, you see it takes commissioners and artists and mission-driven producers. And in this particular case, it also took the audience. The audiences from all over the world. It was extraordinary because we were in all of these festivals where you usually look out and see a bit of a homogenous audience. And in everywhere in the world we went, there was the Cambodian diaspora was in the audience and was so moved, not only by the piece of art, but a piece of their own history. And the diversity of age was extraordinary. There would be grandparents and grandchildren who had never discussed this before. And it was the moment of catharsis. And of course, art is cause for catharsis, but this was so real. You could feel the moment in every audience where they were connecting in such a visceral and personal way and over generations right there in front of you. So that made it just a really, really rare experience that took it beyond art into people's lived experience. So an honor to be a part of that. So thank you all so much. And if everybody, you can also go to bangsokol.cambodianlivingarts.org to view all of the panels in this festival, and also to find out about the Arts Healing 2020 Challenge, which everybody is invited to join. So hope to see you at the rest of our festival. Bye.